going on, everybody? This is Sean of Raw Select Music, and today I want to talk about this record right here. This is Impeach the President by Roy C. and the Honey Drippers, backed with Roy C.'s theme song, released on Alaga Records in 1973. And this is a record that I like so much, and I think is so much of a classic, that I had to buy 2 copies of it. Normally, I would reserve this playing favorites segment for lesser known, more obscure tracks that I think are worth shedding a light on. Yet recently, I thought it was impertinent of me to actually spend some time talk about a track that I think more people are aware of. And also, it gave me an opportunity to look into and discover the history behind this record. So, with that being said, let's shed a little bit of light on a record that probably most people know, even though they may not have heard the original song. So, with that being said, yeah, let's talk about this guy. To tell the story of how this record came to be, you really have to talk about the vocalist, songwriter, and basically mastermind, and that would be Roy Charles Hammond, aka Roy C. Born in Newington, Georgia in 1939, Roy C. took an interest in boxing, of all things. That's right, the history of this underground musical legend doesn't start with a guitar or a musical relative. Rather, the story of Roy C.'s decades-long music career actually comes from an unfortunate sparring match with then-noted heavyweight Tommy Hurricane Jackson. After being introduced to some legendary boxing trainers in Long Island, New York, he would do a sparring match with Hurricane Jackson, and I will let Roy C.'s own words describe how it went down. Take a look right here. Not long after that sparring match, Roy C. decided that boxing really wasn't the thing for him anymore and that he should get into the world of music. Working with a variety of music labels such as Mercury and Atlantic Records, and actually bumping shoulders with some very notable people that worked behind the scenes, including record producer Bob Shad and Jerry Wexler, who, interestingly, was the man who actually coined the term rhythm and blues. Very interesting. But while he did have an on-again, off-again stint with large labels like Mercury, I think, which was the one that he had the longest working relationship with, it was mostly the success that he would find with smaller labels like with Black Hawk Records, which produced the biggest hit of his career called Shotgun Wedding in 1965, which would reach as high as number 14 on the US R&B charts and would reach an even higher charting status in the UK, reaching as high as number 6 on the UK singles chart. It's also noteworthy that during the release of the track Shotgun Wedding is when Roy Hammond finally adopted the moniker Roy C., and that would be the artist name that he would use for the rest of his career. But as previously stated, Roy C. seemingly had a pretty tumultuous relationship with major labels, specifically Mercury Records, who he had dropped out of in the early 70s, would sign again with them after a stint with a record label, which I'll get to in just a minute, until finally departing from major labels altogether after the release of a track from his 1977 album, More Sex and More Soul, had a song called Great Great Grandson a Slave, got him into some very hot water with the record label, and eventually, not wanting to compromise his artistic vision, just decided that he was going to give up on releasing music on major labels and continue to release music on his own labels, which he had had a history of even before he had signed up with Mercury Records again in the 1970s. After being sick of major label politics in the 1970s, he set up 2 of his own labels, one being a record label called Nationwide, and then the other label being this guy right here, Alaga Records. And from 1970 to 1973, Alaga Records was very, very prolific, releasing 13 records, almost all of them being manned, written, and performed by Roy C. himself. But in 1973, eventually, during that year, he would find a high school band from Queens called the Honey Drippers, previously known as the Soul Survivors before Roy C. himself decided to redub them. And shortly after discovering them them. Roy C. would make them his own backing band, use them on several recordings, and while recording this track right here, which, as I understand it, came first in the recording session, he would go on to record this record right here, and the rest, as they say, is history. Boom! Upon listening to Impeach the President for the first time, it's pretty obvious why this track has been sampled so many times. The drums are easily the biggest standout of this track. The kick is extremely dry. Snare has a very distinctive snap to it. The hi-hats have a certain crispiness to it. And what's really interesting about the way that the drums are recorded on this track, every element of the drums is very distinctive. And therefore, if you were to go and sample this song, it would be very easy to pick out what elements that you wanted to without having to deal with too much of trying to separate some of the bleed over from the different parts of the drum kit. But even beyond the overall quality of the drums on here, this is just an honest-to-God great funkin' soul track. From the thick bass and guitar groove, the slick and pervasive saxophone that runs throughout the entire track, and the subtle but organ-filling mix, which isn't inherently obvious until you actually sit and listen to the track very, very closely. It really does sort of fill out the sound of this record. It shouldn't be understated that Roy C.'s vocal presence is so powerful and punchy on here. He's definitely a focal point of the track. You can really tell that he's putting a lot of emotion into his delivery of the lyrics on here. And the back and forth interplay between him and the band, call and responsing off of each other, really just makes for one of the most perfectly crafted tracks of all time. And that's definitely why when I got a chance to pick up 2 copies of this reissue right here, I knew I had to go for doubles. So touching on it a little bit, you do kind of have to go into the sample history of this record, because that in and of itself is very, very interesting. Later on in the 80s, Tough City Records president Aaron Fuchs, I think I said that right, in lieu of money that he owed Marley Marl for a track that he made for Spoonie G, Marley Marl would change the landscape of hip-hop forever by making a track of completely chopped up drums for the MC Shan track, The Bridge. At that point, nobody was really doing any sort of drum chopping the way that he was doing. So what Marley Marl did at that time was absolutely inspired and absolutely influential. And I highly recommend, even though Dubspot, you might want to go check out the Dubspot video that Marley Marl did, going in depth into the history of how that record came about, as well as some of the techniques that he used in order to create that classic sound. Since then, according to WhoSampled.com, Impeach the President has been sampled over 800 credited times, making it the 10th most sampled song of all time. But sadly, this is where the story kind of takes an unfortunate turn, as Roy C., and I can only guess by proxy, the Honey Drippers, as far as I understand it, never saw a dime from all the sampling of this record. In 1992, Aaron Fuchs bought the rights to Impeach the President, sued Def Jam Records for its use in LL Cool J's Around the Way Girl and 6 Minutes of Pleasure, as well as Give the People by EPMD. And unfortunately for Roy C. and the Honey Drippers, this was all happening without any of their knowledge. In fact, as Roy C. describes it in his interview for Wax Poetics magazine, it wasn't until he had heard Janet Jackson's 1993 hit, That's the Way Love Goes, that he found out that people were sampling his song. And after learning about all the sampling that was going on with this track, this would become a battle that he would take to his grave. Since, to my knowledge, despite a multitude of legal battles, he hasn't been able to reclaim the rights to the song since his passing at the age of 81 in September 2020. Yet, the boxing spirit must have still been inside of Roy C., because despite all of the different label trouble that he had had throughout the years, he still fought until the very end. After being dropped from Mercury Records, he started started a third label called 3 Gems and continued to release music throughout the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, largely all on his own labels. So while the story of Roy C. seems to be another casualty of the music industry taking advantage of the people that make money for them, I do think that it's necessary that we celebrate one of the hardest fighting musicians, songwriters, and singers in funk and soul music. It also shouldn't be understated the legacy that he left behind. It's a beloved protest song. Streams of the song were up by 1,053% back in 2019. It's a hip-hop staple, and it's one of the funkiest songs I've ever heard. And thankfully, though, looking around on Discogs, it doesn't look like getting a copy of this record should be too difficult. It's certainly not on the cheaper end of things, but it does look like you should be able to get an original Alaga, not Tough City, for a halfway decent amount of money, 50 to 100 bucks. And I highly recommend that you do it. This is definitely a piece of not only funk and soul, but hip-hop history that I think everyone should own, and it is definitely one of my all-time favorite tracks. So if you've never listened to Impeach the President for yourself, yeah, definitely get on that. Definitely check out this classic funk and soul track for yourself. So that's going to be it for me today, guys. Thanks as always for watching. If you've listened to this song before, let me know what you thought about it down in the comments. Let me know what you think its place in not only funk and soul, but hip-hop history is. And let me hear some of your favorite hip-hop tracks that have sampled this song in the past. If you want to hear this song for yourself or check out some of the other things that I referenced in this video, everything will be linked over in my WordPress blog. And make sure you're always here 8 p.m. Japan Standard Time for Live from the Record Room. There you can hear me play records like the ones that I talk about in these videos, as well as a whole host of other records that I don't get a chance to talk about on this channel. Links to everything, as always, down in the description. But that's going to be it for me today, guys. Thanks as always for watching, and I will catch you in the next video. So until then, peace out!